John Donne was born in 1572 London into a Catholic family during a time when Catholics were being persecuted in England. John had no choice but to renounce his faith and join the Church of England if he were to progress. He lived the rest of his life working with the church until he died in 1630.
John Donne was born in 1572 London into a Catholic family during a time when Catholics were being persecuted in England. John had no choice but to renounce his faith and join the Church of England if he were to progress. He lived the rest of his life working with the church until he died in 1630.
John Donne was born in 1572 London into a Catholic family during a time when Catholics were being persecuted in England. John had no choice but to renounce his faith and join the Church of England if he were to progress. He lived the rest of his life working with the church until he died in 1630. In 1601, John Donne was imprisoned for marrying Anne More without the consent of her father. Several months after the Court of Audience upheld his marriage, he came out financially ruined and was sent to live with his wife's cousin, forming a resentment towards the political system.
In 1601, Donne was imprisoned for marrying Anne More without the consent of her father. Several months after the Court of Audience upheld his marriage, he came out financially ruined and was sent to live with his wife's cousin, forming a resentment towards the political system. In 1601, Donne was imprisoned for marrying Anne More without the consent of her father. Several months after the Court of Audience upheld his marriage, he came out financially ruined and was sent to live with his wife's cousin, forming a resentment towards the political system.
Donne is known as one of the greatest metaphysical poets of his time. A metaphysical poet is an English lyric poet of the 17th century who speculates on topics such as love or religion. Many of John's poems were erotic, but nevertheless found its place in his religious lifestyle.
Donne is known as one of the greatest metaphysical poets, which is an English lyric poet of the 17th century who speculates on topics such as love or religion. Many of his poems, like the canonization, were erotic, but spiritually involved.
The canonization describes love to be transcending. Donne argues that love is essential and spiritual, against a person who is implied as either a religious or a political figure. He speaks on behalf of those who are denied love.
The canonization is a poem about Donne explaining love as transcending and absolute. He argues against the speaker who is implied as a religious or political figure. He speaks for all those who felt persecuted for their love. Through imagery and hyperbole, Donne clarifies that through faith, love is eternal.
Through specific and concrete diction, Donne exacts his role as the speaker who wants justice for all those denied love with vivid imagery. Donne paints a picture of words through religious symbols and their meanings through the forces of nature.
Using specific and concrete diction, Donne exacts his role as the lover through vivid imagery. He paints a picture of a poem through spiritual symbols and expresses his passion against the forces of nature.
Syntax reflected emotional intensity of a dramatic situation in the canonization. In the second stanza, line 13, when did my codes of forward spring remove? The syntax is subject, object, verb, and its meaning is interpreted as when has love caused harm.
Through the canonization, Donne's use of syntax reflects emotional intensity of a dramatic situation. In the second stanza, line 13, when did my chords a forward spring remove? In this case, the syntax is subject, object, verb, describing his love as harmless.
The connotation in the fourth stanza, line 32, will build in sonnets pretty rooms, is an emotional response of eternal love. Donne uses connotation by using emotion through words and through its literal meaning.
In the fourth stanza, line 32, will build in sonnets pretty rooms. In this line, Donne uses connotation as a way to make an emotional response. Through the canonization, the use of connotation brings out the emotional connection between the words and its literal meaning.
Imagery is one of Donne's greatest strengths. For example, from the canonization, in the third stanza, John uses the phoenix, dove, and eagle as the image of immortal love. During the Renaissance, the phoenix represented rebirth, the dove as being feminine, and the eagle as being masculine.
In the third stanza, Donne famously uses imagery by describing the phoenix, dove, and eagle as the image of immortal love. During the Renaissance, the phoenix represented rebirth, dove as feminism, and the eagle as masculinity. Together, love is eternal even after death.
The third stanza also has numerous metaphors to complement the imagery. In line 19, cause what you will, we are made such by love, the metaphor reminds the addressee that the connection people establish is eternal and inseparable, especially when under the name of God.
In the third stanza, line 19, cause what you will, we are made such by love. In this metaphor, Donne reminds the speaker that love is what bonds him and is unbreakable. The third stanza signifies Donne's creative response to how love is perceived.
Donne's life itself is considered a paradox. Donne treats physical love as if it were divine and it's spiritually connected, so expressing it is not a sin. The paradox of his poem is the mixture of Christianity and physical love, which are considered contradictory together.
Donne's life itself is a paradox. Donne treats physical love as if it were divine love, and it has not damaged society or the world itself. The paradox in many of his poems is a mixture of Christianity and physical love, which are considered contradictory.
In the first stanza of line 1, Donne immediately starts off with an apostrophe. For God's sake, hold your tongue and let me love. He is speaking to someone directly, but God, who may or may not be present, is addressed, but immediately grabs the reader's attention with a strong statement.
In the first stanza, line 1, John immediately starts off with an apostrophe. For God's sake, hold your tongue and let me love. John is speaking to someone directly, but God, who may or may not be present, is addressed. It doesn't apply to the comment, marking it as an apostrophe.
From line 1 through 2 of the poem Death Be Not Proud, it says, though some have called thee mighty and dreadful, for thou art not so. This quote is considered among the most famous examples of personification and apostrophe in poetry.
From line 1 to 2 of the poem Death Be Not Proud by John Donne, though some have called thee mighty and dreadful, for thou art not so, considered one of his most famous examples of personification and apostrophe in poetry.
Also, in Meditation 17, the quote, but God's hand is in every translation, the synecdoche makes Donne's faith a strong and dominant presence. The commonality of all Donne's poems is that he always focuses on either religion or love.
From Meditation 17, the God's hand is in every translation. Donne diversifies multiple poems with imagery, paradox, and in this case, synecdoche. The commonality of all literary devices John uses is always focusing on either religion or love.
By using alliteration, the repetition of sound made John's poem sound more appealing, even though the poem was meant to draw out an emotional response. The alliteration can be found in the first stanza of line 3 when he writes fortune flout.
Another technique John put to use was alliteration. The repetition of sound made John's poem sound more appealing, even though the poem was arguing with a strong case. Alliteration can be found in line 3, when John writes, fortune flout.
Toward the end of the poem, the canonization is determined to be the true canon of love, which models after for all the world to follow. This overstatement or hyperbole, found at the very end, reads as countries, towns, courts beg from above a pattern of your love.
By the end of the poem, the canonization is determined to be the true canon of love, which models after for all the world to follow. This statement or hyperbole is found at the very end and reads as countries, towns, courts beg from above a pattern of your love.
Throughout the poem, the tone is consistently balanced between common sense and passion. Love does no harm to others, and love is everlasting. In the second stanza, line 10, alas, alas, who's injured by my love, the tone remains passionate and logical.
The overall tone is consistently balanced between common sense and passion. Love does no harm to others, and his love is everlasting. The second stanza, line 10, alas, alas, who is injured by my love? The tone remains passionate and logical.
Ironically, the problems these lovers face are opposite of those of a saint or a person in any religious position. The irony is that the lovers are using religion as their motive. Even Donne, who himself is a priest, is the voice for these people.
Ironically, the lover from the canonization faces problems opposite of those of a saint or a person in a religious position. The irony is the emphasis Donne puts to physical love, but as a priest it shouldn't concern him.
As a closed form poem, the canonization consists of 5 9-line stanzas, metered in iambic lines from trimester to pentameter. The rhyme scheme in each stanza is A, B, B, A, C, 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 D, D.
The canonization is a closed form poem consisting of 5 9-line stanzas, metered in iambic lines from trimester to pentameter. The rhyme scheme in each stanza is A, B, B, A, C, 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 D, D.
Symbolically, the dove and eagle represent the relationship between lovers, with the phoenix as the guide. The eagle represents male strength, the dove represents female gentleness, and the phoenix represents the religious symbol of rebirth or resurrection, awaiting the lovers in the afterlife.
The symbol of the dove and eagle are used to describe the relationship of their love, with the phoenix binding them through faith. The eagle representing male strength, and the dove representing female gentleness, and the phoenix representing the religious symbol of rebirth or resurrection awaiting the lovers. The symbol of the dove and the eagle are used to describe the relationship of the lovers, with the phoenix binding them through faith. The eagle represents male strength, the dove represents female gentleness, and the phoenix represents the religious symbol of rebirth or resurrection awaiting the lovers.
By the end of John's life, he wrote many sermons rather than poems, remaining faithful to his roots until the very end. One of the most famous ones being No Man is an Island. His ingenious way to mix spiritual devotion and physical love remains unparalleled to this very day.
At the end of John's life, he wrote many sermons rather than poems. One of the most famous ones being No Man is an Island. His ingenious way to mix spiritual devotion and physical love remains unparalleled.